The Forgotten. It was a summer that should have been forgotten, a summer buried under layers of everyday life, obscured by the passage of time. But for Clara, it was impossible to forget. It all started when she and her two friends, David and Lily, decided to spend the summer in an old house that Clara's family had inherited. The house was located in a small, remote town called Blackwood, nestled deep within a forest that seemed to be forgotten by the rest of the world. Clara had never been there before, and the idea of spending the summer in a secluded, ancient house seemed like the perfect escape from their mundane lives. The house itself was massive, with creaking wooden floors, narrow hallways that twisted and turned in unexpected directions, and rooms filled with dust-covered furniture. Despite its dilapidated state, the house had a certain charm that Clara found alluring. It was like stepping back in time, to a place where life moved at a slower pace, and where the outside world could be shut out completely. As they settled in, Clara, David, and Lily quickly fell into a routine of exploring the house and its grounds during the day, and spending the evenings playing cards or telling ghost stories by the fireplace. The nearest town was miles away, and they rarely saw anyone else. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. But that peace was shattered one day when Clara found the diary. She had been rummaging through the attic, searching for anything interesting among the old trunks and boxes that had been left behind. Most of what she found was ordinary, old clothes, books, and photographs. But then, tucked away in the back of a dusty trunk, she found a small leather-bound diary. The cover was worn and cracked, and the pages yellowed with age. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Intrigued, Clara wiped away the dust and opened it. The first few pages were filled with neat, cursive handwriting. The entries were dated from the summer of 1927, and they detailed the daily life of a young woman named Emily. At first, the entries were ordinary, descriptions of the weather, accounts of what she had done that day, and musings about her future. But as Clara read on, the tone of the diary began to change. The entries grew more erratic, the handwriting more hurried and uneven. Emily began to write about strange occurrences in the house, objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing without reason, and whispers that she could hear at night coming from the walls. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she read Emily's words. She could almost hear the desperation in her voice as she described how the house seemed to be alive, how it was watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down. The last entry was written on August 14th, 1927. It was short, just a few sentences scrawled hastily across the page. "I can't take it anymore. The house is suffocating me. I hear them every night whispering, calling my name. They're in the walls. I know what they want now, and I can't let them have it. I have to end this." That was the last thing Emily had written. Clara flipped through the remaining pages, but they were all blank. She sat there in the attic, the diary clutched in her hands, a feeling of unease settling over her. What had Emily meant? Who or what was in the walls? Clara spent the rest of the day in a daze, her mind racing with questions. She didn't mention the diary to David or Lily, not wanting to worry them. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. Sleep eluded her, and as the hours ticked by, she found herself listening intently to the sounds of the old house. Every creak, every groan of the wood, every rustle of the wind outside. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but then she heard it. A faint whisper. At first she thought it was just the wind, but then she heard it again, clearer this time. "Clara!" Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight that peeked through the curtains. She strained to listen, but the whispering had stopped. She waited, every muscle in her body tense, but the only sound was the steady thumping of her own heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, she lay back down, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. The next day, Clara tried to push the events of the previous night out of her mind, but it was impossible. She was jumpy, on edge, and every little sound made her heart skip a beat. David and Lily noticed her unease and asked if something was wrong, but she brushed them off, not wanting to worry them. As the day wore on, the oppressive feeling in the house only grew stronger. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the walls were closing in around them. Clara found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, as though she expected to see someone or something standing behind her. That night, Clara heard the whispers again. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were clearer, louder, and they seemed to be coming from all around her. "Clara!" She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The whispers continued, growing more insistent. "Clara, come to us!" Clara squeezed her eyes shut, willing the voices to go away, but they only grew louder, more desperate. "Come to us, Clara!" Suddenly there was a loud bang from downstairs. Clara's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. She threw off the covers and ran out of her room, down the hall to David and Lily's room. She burst through the door, finding them both sitting up in bed, looking as frightened as she felt. "Did you hear that?" David asked, his voice trembling. Clara nodded, too shaken to speak. They all hurried downstairs, where they found the front door standing wide open, the cold night air blowing in. They stared at the door, none of them daring to move. David and Lily looked at her, their faces pale in the dim light. "What do you mean?" Lily asked. Clara hesitated, then told them about the diary, about the whispers she had been hearing. She expected them to dismiss her concerns, to tell her she was just imagining things, but instead, they looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. "We've been hearing them too," David admitted. The whispers. Clara's blood ran cold. She had hoped that it was all in her head, that the diary had just planted the idea in her mind, but now she knew it was real. Something was in the house with them. They spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, too scared to go back to their rooms. The whispers continued, growing louder as the night went on, until they seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. By morning, the decision was made. They had to leave the house, no matter what. But when they tried to leave, they found that they couldn't. The front door refused to open no matter how hard they pulled. The windows were sealed shut, and even the back door wouldn't budge. It was as though the house had trapped them inside, determined to keep them there. Panic set in. They searched the house from top to bottom, looking for any way out, but there was none. They were trapped, and the whispers continued. Days passed, though it was hard to keep track of time in the suffocating darkness of the house. The whispers were constant now, filling every corner of the house, echoing through the walls, seeping into their minds. Clara could feel herself slipping, her sanity unraveling with each passing hour. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, and they no longer called just her name. They called all three of them. "Clara, David, Lily, come to us." She could see the toll it was taking on her friends as well. David was jumpy, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, and Lily had grown pale and withdrawn, barely speaking anymore. The house was eating them alive. One night, after what felt like an eternity, the whispers reached a fever pitch. They were so loud, so overwhelming that Clara thought her head might split open. She stumbled through the dark hallways, clutching her head, trying to escape the voices that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "Clara, David, Lily, come to us." The whispers seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if something was inside them, calling to her, beckoning her closer. She stumbled down the hallway, the whispers pulling her toward the source, until she found herself in front of a door she had never noticed before. It was a small, unassuming door, tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway. The wood was old and cracked, and it looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and they were coming from behind the door. "Come to us." Clara reached out with a trembling hand and grasped the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch, and she had to force herself to turn it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. The whispers were calling her down the stairs, urging her to descend into the unknown. Clara hesitated, fear gripping her heart, but she knew she had no choice. Whatever was behind those whispers, whatever was hiding in the darkness, it had been waiting for her, for all of them. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the first step. The wood groaned under her weight, and she could feel the cold seeping up from below. Slowly she descended the staircase, the whispers guiding her every step. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the earth. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides, but she kept going, drawn forward by the whispers that echoed in her mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the bottom. The staircase opened up into a small, cramped room, barely large enough to stand in. The walls were made of rough stone, cold and damp to the touch, and the only light came from a single, flickering candle that sat in the center of the room. And there, in the middle of the room, was a small wooden chest. The whispers were louder now, almost frantic, as they urged her toward the chest. Clara approached it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the cold emanating from the chest, a deep, bone-chilling cold that made her shiver. With trembling hands, she reached out and lifted the lid. Inside the chest was a small wooden box, no larger than a shoebox. It was intricately carved, with strange symbols and designs that she didn't recognize. The whispers were coming from the box, vibrating through the air, filling her mind with their insistent calls. "Open it." Clara hesitated for a moment, fear and dread warring within her. She didn't want to know what was inside, didn't want to face whatever horror was waiting for her. But she knew she had no choice. The house had brought her here for a reason, and there was no escaping it. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid of the box. Inside was a small, delicate-looking figurine, carved from what looked like bone. It was a woman, or at least something resembling a woman, with long, flowing hair and a twisted, distorted face. The figure was clutching something to its chest, a small black stone, smooth and polished. As soon as Clara laid eyes on the stone, the whispers reached a crescendo, filling the room with their deafening chorus. "Take it! Take it!" Clara reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the stone. It was cold, so cold that it burned her skin, but she couldn't let go. As soon as her fingers closed around it, the whispers stopped. And silence filled the room, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press down on her from all sides. For a moment she thought she was finally free of the whispers, that she had done what the house had wanted, but then she heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from behind her. Slowly she turned around. In the darkness at the edge of the room, something was moving. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out forever. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It was the thing that had been whispering to her, the thing that had been calling her name, and now it was free. Clara stumbled back, her heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The creature loomed over her, its eyes fixed on the stone in her hand. "Give it to me," it hissed, its voice low and menacing. Clara clutched the stone to her chest, backing away from the creature. "What do you want with it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The creature's grin widened, its teeth gleaming in the darkness. "It's mine, you were never supposed to find it." Clara's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The stone, the whispers, the house, it was all connected. The house had been trying to keep the stone hidden, trying to keep the creature imprisoned. But now she had unleashed it, and there was no putting it back. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Clara turned and ran back up the stairs, the stone still clutched tightly in her hand. She could hear the creature's footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate as it followed her up the staircase. She burst out of the door at the top of the stairs and slammed it shut behind her, locking it with trembling hands, but she knew it wouldn't hold the creature for long. "Clara!" She turned to see David and Lily standing in the hallway, their faces pale with fear. They had heard the commotion and come to find her. "We have to get out of here!" Clara shouted, grabbing their hands and pulling them down the hallway. "We have to get out of the house." "But how?" David asked, his voice shaking. "The doors and windows won't open." Clara didn't have an answer. All she knew was that they had to get away from the creature, had to get out of the house before it caught up to them. As they ran down the hallway, the walls began to shake, the house groaning and creaking as if it were coming alive. The whispers started up again, louder and more frantic than ever, echoing through the walls. "Come to us! Come to us!" Clara felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the whispers drilled into her mind. She stumbled, nearly falling, but David caught her and helped her keep moving. They reached the front door and tried to pull it open, but it was still stuck, as if something was holding it shut. Clara pounded on the door, screaming in frustration. "Let us out! Please let us out!" The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she could feel the house closing in around them, the walls seeming to move, to twist and warp. The creature was getting closer, its footsteps growing louder and louder as it approached. Just when Clara thought all hope was lost, there was a loud crack, and the door suddenly flew open. They didn't waste a second. Clara, David, and Lily ran out into the night, not stopping until they were far away from the house, deep into the forest. Only then did they stop to catch their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. The house loomed behind them, dark and silent. But Clara knew it wasn't over. The creature was still inside, still waiting, still whispering. They couldn't stay in Blackwood. They had to leave, had to get as far away from the house as possible. They made their way to the nearest town, where they found a phone and called for help. Clara's parents were shocked to hear from her. They had been trying to contact her for days, but the phone lines to the house had been dead. They never spoke of what had happened in Blackwood. The authorities investigated the house but found nothing unusual. No sign of the creature, no evidence of the whispers. The diary Clara had found was gone, vanished without a trace. But the memory of that summer never faded. The whispers haunted Clara's dreams. The creature's yellow eyes burned into her mind. She knew it was still out there, waiting, watching, whispering her name, and deep down she knew that one day it would find her again. The silent playground. The playground was a forgotten relic, hidden at the edge of the woods that bordered the small town of Pine Hollow. No one knew when it was built or why it had been abandoned, but for as long as anyone could remember, it had stood there, rusting and decaying under the weight of time. It wasn't on any map, and you had to know where to look to find it. The trail leading to it was overgrown with weeds, the trees crowding close together as if trying to hide the path from prying eyes. But every year, when summer rolled around and the days grew long and lazy, kids from the town would dare each other to find the playground, to play there at dusk, and to see if the rumors were true. The rumors had been around for decades, passed down from older siblings to younger, growing more elaborate with each retelling. They said the playground was haunted, that the swings moved on their own, that if you stayed after dark you could hear the laughter of children who had vanished long ago. But most of all, they said that no one who stayed after dark ever returned the same. That summer it was Emma's turn. She was 12, at that age where the line between bravery and fear is razor thin, and the desire to prove oneself to friends can outweigh common sense. Her older brother, Jack, had gone to the playground when he was her age, and though he never talked about what happened, Emma knew he had seen something. She could see it in the way his eyes darkened whenever the playground was mentioned. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Emma set off alone, determined to conquer the playground. Her friends had teased her for weeks, daring her to go and prove she wasn't afraid. Now was her chance. The path through the woods was narrow and twisted, the branches overhead forming a thick canopy that blocked out most of the remaining light. As she walked, Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The woods were unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects absent, as if the forest was holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the playground. It was even more dilapidated than she had imagined. The metal of the swings and slide was covered in rust, the wood of the seesaw splintered and worn. The merry-go-round was tilted at an odd angle, as though it had been abandoned mid-spin. Emma stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest. The place felt wrong, like it was stuck in time, untouched by the world outside. She wanted to turn back, to run home and tell her friends she had done it, but something held her there. Slowly she walked toward the swings. They were motionless, hanging limply from their chains, but as she got closer, a faint breeze picked up, making them sway gently. The creak of the chains was the only sound in the stillness. Emma hesitated, then sat down on one of the swings. The metal was cold against her skin, sending a shiver up her spine. She pushed off the ground, letting the swing carry her higher and higher, the wind whipping through her hair. For a moment, she almost felt at peace, the eerie silence of the playground fading away as she focused on the motion of the swing. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On the merry-go-round, a figure was sitting, watching her. The figure was small, childlike, but its features were blurred, as if it were made of smoke. Emma froze, her hands tightening on the chains of the swing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just sat there, staring at her with eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. Emma's heart raced as she realized the sun had almost completely set. The woods around her were growing darker, the shadows lengthening and closing in. The figure on the merry-go-round began to move, slowly, turning to face her fully. And then it smiled. It was a smile that didn't belong to a child. It was too wide, too sharp, the teeth gleaming in the dim light. Emma felt a wave of terror wash over her, but she couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing on the merry-go-round. Suddenly, the other swing beside her began to move, creaking on its rusted hinges. It swung back and forth as though someone invisible was sitting on it, pushing themselves higher and higher. The seesaw began to move as well, the wooden plank creaking as it rocked up and down. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the playground came to life around her, the old equipment groaning and clattering as if driven by some unseen force. The figure on the merry-go-round stood up, its form shifting and warping, growing taller, its limbs elongating into grotesque shapes. The laughter started then, a high-pitched, eerie sound that echoed through the playground, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was the laughter of children, but twisted, distorted, filled with malice. But there was no escape. The figure from the merry-go-round was coming closer now, its distorted face leering at her, its smile widening as it reached out with long, spindly fingers. Emma backed away until she hit the slide, the cold metal pressing against her back. The last light of the sun faded completely, plunging the playground into darkness. The only light came from the eyes of the figure, glowing faintly in the night. Emma could feel the cold seeping into her bones, the darkness closing in around her, suffocating her. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The playground was silent once more. When they found her the next morning, Emma was sitting on the swing, her eyes wide and unseeing, her face pale as death. She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't react to anything or anyone. Her friends tried to get her to tell them what had happened, what she had seen, but she only stared into the distance, her expression blank. They never found out what happened to Emma that night, what horrors she had witnessed in the darkness of the playground. She never spoke again, her mind lost somewhere in that forgotten clearing at the edge of the woods. But the kids of Pine Hollow knew better than to go looking for the playground after that. They left it to its rust and decay, to the ghosts that lingered there, waiting for the next child foolish enough to wander too far from home. The waiting room. The first time I walked into the waiting room, it felt like any other mundane doctor's office. The walls were painted a dull beige, the lighting was cold and fluorescent, and a stack of outdated magazines sat on a low table in the center of the room. A lone, fake potted plant stood in the corner, its leaves dust-covered and lifeless. I had been feeling off for weeks, just an undefined sense of dread that I couldn't shake. When I found a business card for Dr. Ashton Specialist tucked into my mailbox, I was intrigued. It didn't have any of the usual details, just a name, a title, and an address. No phone number, no specialty listed. But I was desperate for answers, and against my better judgment, I decided to make the trip. The receptionist didn't ask for my name when I arrived. She simply nodded, handed me a clipboard with a blank sheet of paper, and motioned for me to take a seat. I filled out my information and returned the clipboard, expecting to be called back soon. But time dragged on. I glanced at the clock on the wall, watching the second hand tick forward at an agonizingly slow pace. The minutes stretched into hours, and yet no one called my name. There were others in the room too. They sat in the same stiff plastic chairs, their eyes glazed over, staring blankly at the walls. Some of them fidgeted, their fingers tapping nervously against the armrests. Others sat completely still, their hands clasped tightly in their laps. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man sitting next to me, but he just looked through me as if I wasn't even there. The air in the room was heavy, thick with an unsettling silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I pulled out my phone to check the time, only to find that it had no signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing. The screen was stuck at 3:33 p.m., and the battery indicator flashed a warning in red. I got up to ask the receptionist how much longer it would be. She was gone. The desk was empty, the door behind it slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. I hesitated for a moment, considering whether I should just leave. But something compelled me to stay, a gnawing curiosity mixed with a paralyzing fear. I returned to my seat and waited. The hours blurred together, and I must have dozed off because I woke up with a start, my neck stiff and sore from the awkward position I had been slumped in. The clock still read 3:33 p.m. The same people sat in the same positions, as if they hadn't moved at all. My mouth was dry, my stomach growling, but I couldn't remember the last time I ate. I got up again, this time with the intent to leave, but as I walked to the door I found it locked. The handle wouldn't budge. Panic started to rise in my chest as I turned around and tried the other doors, one leading to the restrooms, another to what I assumed was an office. Both were locked as well. The receptionist's door was still slightly open, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it. I didn't want to go inside, but something deep within me, that same horrible curiosity, drove me to push it open. The room was pitch black, the air inside cold and damp. I fumbled along the wall searching for a light switch. My fingers brushed against something wet and slimy, and I jerked back, my heart pounding. And suddenly the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in darkness. I banged on it, shouting for help, but my voice was swallowed by the void. The smell hit me then, an overwhelming stench of decay and rot that made me gag. I wasn't alone in the dark. I could hear them breathing, the ragged, wet gasps of something inhuman, something that shuffled closer with each passing second. My skin prickled as the sound of nails scraping against the floor echoed around me. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was in that room. Then I felt it, ice-cold fingers brushing against my ankle. I screamed, kicking out, but my foot met only empty air. The breathing grew louder, more desperate, like something was trying to inhale me, to consume me. I flailed, searching for the door handle, but it was gone. There was no way out. The room seemed to stretch on forever, the walls receding into an infinite void. I could feel them now, multiple hands, fingers wrapping around my wrists, my ankles, my throat. I was being pulled down, dragged into the floor itself as if the ground had turned to quicksand. I screamed, clawing at the darkness, but it was no use. My vision blurred as the air was forced from my lungs. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, the grip on me loosened and I fell hard onto a cold, sterile floor. The lights flickered on, harsh and blinding. I was back in the waiting room. The clock still read 3:33 p.m., but the people were gone. The chairs were empty, the receptionist's desk abandoned. I stood up, my legs shaky, my body drenched in sweat. The front door was open. I didn't question it. I bolted for the exit, stumbling into the daylight outside. The fresh air was like a balm, but it did little to calm the terror still thrumming through my veins. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, desperate to get as far away from that place as possible. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, the building standing alone in the middle of an empty lot, surrounded by a dense fog that hadn't been there before. I didn't look back again. It's been weeks since that day, and I haven't told anyone what happened. I don't think anyone would believe me if I did, but I haven't been the same since. The sense of dread has only grown stronger, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed me out of that room. Every night, I wake up at exactly 3:33 a.m., gasping for breath as if I'm being suffocated by invisible hands. The darkness in my room feels alive, pulsating with a malevolent presence that watches, waits. And sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the breathing again. It's getting closer. And I know, deep down, that one day it will catch me. When it does, I'll be dragged back into that waiting room where time stands still, and I'll never leave again. The shadow on the stairs. It started as a subtle annoyance. Every night around 11 p.m. I'd hear creaks on the stairs just outside my bedroom door. At first I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe a stray gust of wind, but then the noises became more distinct. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, climbing the stairs one step at a time. One night I decided to wait up and see what was causing the noise. I turned off all the lights and sat on my bed, staring at the crack under the door, waiting. The house was silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock on my nightstand. Then, at exactly 11 p.m., the sound began. Creak, creak, creak. The footsteps were heavier than before, almost as if someone was dragging something up the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the crack under the door, the faint light from the hallway barely illuminating the dark wood. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, a shadow appeared under the door, long and thin, as if someone was standing just inches away. I wanted to open the door, to confront whatever was out there, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by an instinctive fear that told me not to look. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, a cold gaze piercing through the wood, rooting me to the spot. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Finally, the shadow began to retreat, the footsteps resuming their slow, deliberate pace, descending the stairs one by one until they faded into nothingness. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I checked the stairs, looking for any signs of what had been there. The wood was worn and old, but there were no marks, no traces of anything unusual. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the lack of sleep was playing tricks on me. But the next night, it happened again. The footsteps, the shadow. Everything was the same. And the night after that, and the night after that. Each time the shadow lingered longer outside my door, its presence growing more oppressive, more real. I began to dread the approach of 11 p.m., knowing that the footsteps would soon follow. I tried staying out late, even considered sleeping somewhere else, but something always pulled me back home, back to that bedroom, as if the house itself wouldn't let me leave. Then, one night, the footsteps didn't stop outside my door. They kept going, moving closer, until I heard the soft creak of the floorboards just inches from where I lay. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow seeped through the crack under the door, spreading across the floor like a dark, creeping mist. I closed my eyes, praying it would go away, but I could feel it hovering over me, cold and oppressive. The air grew thick and I struggled to breathe, my chest tightening as if something was pressing down on it. A whisper filled the room, barely audible but unmistakable. "I'm here." I don't know how long it stayed, how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, but when I finally dared to open my eyes, the shadow was gone. The room was empty, the door still shut, the house silent. But I know it's not over. The footsteps continue every night and the shadow still lingers outside my door, waiting. Each night it gets closer, the whisper growing louder, more insistent. "I'm here." And I know that one night, I won't be able to keep my eyes closed. One night I'll have to look, and when I do, it will be the last thing I ever see. The house at Ashford Grove. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other's business and secrets were hard to keep. But there was one place that everyone avoided, a place no one talked about unless they had to. The house at Ashford Grove. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. It was a hulking, decrepit mansion that sat at the end of a long, winding road, hidden behind a thick wall of trees and overgrown shrubs. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and the once grand front porch was now little more than a collection of rotting boards. When I was a kid, the older kids would dare each other to go up to the house, to knock on the door or peek inside the windows. But no one ever did it. Not really. There was something about the place that just felt wrong, like a cold shiver that ran down your spine whenever you got too close. It was as if the house itself didn't want to be disturbed. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the house, how it had once belonged to a wealthy family who had mysteriously vanished one night. They were never found, and the house had been left to rot, untouched for decades. She told me that strange things happened there, that people who went inside never came out the same. I didn't believe her, of course. They were just ghost stories, the kind that old people tell to scare kids into behaving. But as I got older, the stories stuck with me, lodged in the back of my mind like a splinter. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the house, something real. When I turned 18, I decided I had to find out for myself. It was late October, the air crisp with the first bite of winter, when I finally gathered the courage to go. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not my friends, not my parents. I just grabbed a flashlight, threw on my jacket, and headed out to Ashford Grove. The road was deserted, the houses growing fewer and farther between as I walked. The trees loomed overhead, their branches bare and twisted like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. As I approached the house, I could feel my heart start to race, a nervous excitement mingled with a deep, primal fear. The gate was rusted and hanging off its hinges, the once manicured lawn now a tangled mess of weeds and thorns. I hesitated for a moment at the entrance, staring up at the dark silhouette of the mansion against the night sky. For a brief second, I considered turning back, but the thought of spending the rest of my life wondering what was inside pushed me forward. I made my way up the cracked stone path, my footsteps crunching against the gravel. The porch groaned under my weight as I stepped onto it, the wood splintering beneath my boots. I reached out and touched the door, the wood cold and rough under my fingers. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty house. I shone my flashlight inside, the beam cutting through the thick darkness that clung to every corner. The air was stale, heavy with dust and decay. I could see the remains of old furniture scattered throughout the foyer, an overturned chair, a shattered mirror, a once elegant chandelier that now lay in pieces on the floor. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The house felt different than I expected, colder, emptier. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the place, leaving behind a void that pressed in on me from all sides. I wandered through the first floor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The rooms were all in a state of disrepair, the walls peeling, the floors warped from years of neglect. I found the kitchen, the dining room, a sitting room filled with tattered armchairs and a moth-eaten rug. But there was no sign of anything unusual, nothing that explained the stories my grandmother had told me. But then I found the staircase. It was in the back of the house, hidden behind a heavy wooden door that had been left ajar. The stairs were narrow and steep, the steps covered in a thick layer of dust. As I shone my flashlight up the staircase, I noticed something strange. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one cracked and stained with age. A sense of unease washed over me as I started to climb the stairs. The mirrors reflected the beam of my flashlight in odd, disorienting ways, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. I tried not to look at them, focusing instead on the steps in front of me. But out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing things, flickers of movement, shapes that didn't belong. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I found myself in a long hallway lined with doors, each one identical to the last. The air was colder up here, the silence more oppressive. I felt as if I were being watched, as if the house itself were aware of my presence. I opened the first door on my left and stepped inside. It was a bedroom, or at least it had been once. The bed was still there, the mattress sagging in the middle, the sheets torn and yellowed with age. A dresser stood against the far wall, its drawers hanging open, their contents strewn across the floor. There was a large window, the glass cracked and dirty, through which I could see the tops of the trees swaying in the wind. But it wasn't the bed or the dresser that caught my attention. It was the writing on the walls. Every inch of the room was covered in words, scrawled in a dark reddish-brown substance that I didn't want to think too hard about. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, the letters overlapping each other in a chaotic mess. I couldn't make out what it said, but there was something frantic, almost desperate about the way the words had been written. As I turned to leave, my flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I cursed under my breath, shaking the flashlight, trying to get it to work, but it was dead. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft that I almost missed it. It came from the hallway just outside the door. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was calling me. I clenched the key in my hand, the metal digging into my palm as I stepped back into the hallway. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to follow. I could feel the pull of it, a strange compulsion that I couldn't resist. I followed the sound down the hallway, past the rows of closed doors. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, though I still couldn't understand them. They were jumbled, overlapping, as if multiple voices were speaking at once, but they all seemed to be saying the same thing, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Help us! Help us!" I felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct telling me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the compulsion was stronger. I had to know what was down there. I had to see. I descended the staircase, my hand gripping the banister for support. The steps were steep and uneven, each one creaking ominously under my weight. The darkness grew thicker the deeper I went, until I could barely see my hand in front of my face. When I reached the bottom, the whispering stopped. I found myself in a small stone-walled chamber, the air damp and cold. The walls were covered in moss and mildew, and the floor was uneven, littered with debris. In the center of the room was a large iron door, its surface covered in intricate carvings that I couldn't make out in the dim light. The key in my hand seemed to pulse with warmth as I approached the door. I could feel something behind it, something old and powerful, something that had been waiting for a long time. My hand shook as I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a dark, narrow passage beyond. The air that rushed out was colder than ice, sending a shiver down my spine. But it wasn't just the cold that made me hesitate, it was the smell. It was the stench of death, of rot and decay so overpowering that it made my stomach turn. I gagged, covering my mouth with my hand as I stepped into the passage, the darkness swallowing me whole. The walls closed in around me, the space so tight that I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The floor was slick with some kind of slime, and the air was thick with the sound of dripping water. The smell grew stronger the deeper I went, until it was all I could do to keep from vomiting. Then, suddenly, the passage opened up into a large, cavernous room. My flashlight flickered back to life, casting a weak beam of light across the space. The room was enormous, the ceiling lost in shadows high above. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with dozens of glass jars. The jars were covered in dust and grime, but I could see the faint outlines of what was inside, shriveled, twisted shapes floating in murky liquid. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at: preserved body parts, some human, some not. Arms, legs, hands, and heads all floating in those jars, their features distorted and unrecognizable. But the jars weren't the only thing in the room. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight, was a large stone slab, and on that slab lay a figure covered in a tattered sheet. My heart raced as I approached the slab, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure was still, deathly still, but I could feel a presence emanating from it, a cold, malevolent energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the edge of the sheet. I hesitated, a voice in the back of my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn back while I still could. But I ignored it. I had come this far. I had to know. With trembling hands, I pulled the sheet back. The figure beneath was human, at least it had been once. The skin was pale and shriveled, pulled tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. The eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, and the mouth was frozen in a rictus grin, revealing rows of blackened teeth. But it wasn't just the state of the body that horrified me. It was the fact that I recognized it. It was me. I staggered back, my mind reeling, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. But there was no mistaking it. The corpse on the slab was identical to me in every way. Same height, same build, same features. Even the clothes it wore were the same as the ones I had on. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment the beam of light caught something else. Another figure standing at the edge of the room watching me. I whipped the flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just shadows, shifting and twisting in the darkness. But I knew I had seen something. Someone. The whispering started again, louder now, more insistent, filling the room with its maddening chorus. "Help us! Help us!" I turned and ran, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly as I bolted back down the narrow passage. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. The whispering followed me, growing louder, closer, until it was all I could hear. I burst out of the passage and into the stone-walled chamber, slamming the iron door shut behind me. The whispering stopped abruptly, the silence so sudden that it was deafening. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I raced up the stairs, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. The house was different now, warmer, brighter, as if the darkness that had clung to it was lifting. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get out, to escape whatever nightmare I had unleashed. I ran out the front door and into the night, not stopping until I was far away from Ashford Grove, until the house was just a distant memory. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? Who could believe that I had seen my own corpse, that I had heard the voices of the dead? But I can't forget. The memory haunts me, follows me wherever I go. I can still hear the whispering sometimes, in the dead of night when everything is quiet. It's fainter now, more distant, but it's still there. And sometimes when I'm alone, I see shadows where there shouldn't be any, watching, waiting. I know that one day they'll come for me. One day I'll have to go back to the house at Ashford Grove, and when I do, I won't come out the same. The door in the basement. I always knew there was something off about the house. It wasn't just the creaky floors or the way the wind seemed to howl through the old wooden beams at night. It was the door in the basement. When I first moved in, the landlord had been oddly specific about it. "Don't worry about the basement," she said. "There's nothing down there worth your time." She smiled, but her eyes darted away from mine as if she couldn't quite meet my gaze. At first, I listened. The house was cheap, in a good neighborhood, and I didn't want to rock the boat. I settled in, unpacked my boxes, and tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. But the door was always there, at the end of a narrow hallway tucked behind the stairs. It seemed to beckon me every time I passed by. It was an old wooden door, chipped and worn, with a rusty iron handle that looked like it hadn't been turned in decades. A week went by before I gave in to my curiosity. It was late at night and I couldn't sleep. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I found myself standing in front of the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. My breath fogged in front of me and a shiver ran down my spine. I hesitated, but something deep inside urged me to turn the handle, to see what was on the other side. The door creaked open, revealing a set of stairs that led down into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was damp and musty, with a faint metallic tang that made my nose wrinkle. I fumbled for the light switch, but there was none, only darkness. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned under my weight, but I pressed on, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall for balance. As I descended, the air grew colder and the smell grew stronger. It was familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, but it was still too dim to see much. I could make out vague shapes, boxes, old furniture, and something else, something that glinted in the faint light filtering down from above. I stepped closer, squinting in the darkness. It was a mirror, leaning against the far wall. An old ornate mirror with a cracked silver frame. I approached it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. As I drew nearer, I realized the mirror was reflecting something that shouldn't have been there. There was nothing behind me but the stairs and the darkness, yet in the reflection, I saw a figure, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared back at me from the depths of the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, but its gaze was fixed on me, unblinking. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. Then slowly the figure raised a hand and pointed, not at me, but at something behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there, just the empty basement and the stairs leading back up to safety. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. I backed away, my hands trembling, and stumbled toward the stairs. I didn't look back as I fled up the steps, slamming the door shut behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat in the living room, every light in the house turned on, my eyes fixed on the basement door. I didn't sleep. The next day, I called the landlord, demanding to know what was in the basement. She was silent for a long time before she finally spoke. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "The others, they didn't listen either. The door, the basement. It's not just a part of the house, it's something older, something that's been there long before the house was built." I didn't stay to find out more. I packed my things and left that very day. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house just once. The basement window was dark, but I thought I saw a figure standing there watching me leave. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of that door, of what might have happened if I hadn't turned and run, and when I wake up, I can still feel the cold air on my skin and the faint metallic smell that haunts my memories. The Forgotten Room. Jake had lived in the old farmhouse for almost a year before he discovered the room. The house was large, with winding hallways and more doors than seemed necessary, so it wasn't surprising that he hadn't noticed it before. But one night, while wandering the halls unable to sleep, he found it. The door was plain and unmarked, tucked away at the end of a narrow corridor he rarely visited. Something about it felt off, though Jake couldn't put his finger on why. The paint was chipped, and the wood felt unnaturally cold under his hand. Without really thinking, he turned the knob and pushed it open. Inside was a small, windowless room, lit only by the soft glow of moonlight filtering in through a crack in the ceiling. The air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something sweet but rotten. The room was empty except for a single, small wooden chair in the center. On it sat a dusty old doll. It was a child's toy, the kind with button eyes and a sewn-on smile, but its face was dirty and stained, as if it had been weeping dark tears for years. And Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine as he stepped inside. The door swung shut behind him with a soft click. He turned to open it, but the knob wouldn't budge. His heart started to race. He turned back to the room and his eyes locked onto the doll. It was no longer sitting in the chair. It was standing on the floor, facing him. The doll's button eyes seemed to glint in the dim light, and its sewn-on smile now looked like a cruel smirk. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He could swear he saw the doll's head tilt, ever so slightly. Then in the silence, he heard a soft, childlike giggle. It echoed around the room, though there was no one else there. Panicking, Jake pounded on the door, trying to force it open. But it wouldn't budge. The giggling grew louder, closer, and he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, but the room was empty again. The doll was back on the chair, but this time, its head was turned to the side, as if watching him. And Jake slammed his shoulder into the door, desperate to escape. Finally, with a loud crack, the door flew open and he stumbled out into the hallway. He didn't look back as he fled the house, not stopping until he was outside, panting in the cool night air. The next morning, he returned with a locksmith, determined to get rid of that cursed room for good. But when they reached the end of the hallway, the door was gone. The wall was solid, unbroken, with no sign that there had ever been a door there at all. Jake moved out of the farmhouse the very next day, but sometimes, when he's alone in a quiet room, he still hears that soft, childlike giggle echoing from somewhere just beyond the walls. The last broadcast. It was the fall of 1998 when I moved to the small, unremarkable town of Coldbrook. A new job opportunity had lured me to the town, and I thought the change of scenery might be good for me. Nestled deep in a valley and surrounded by dense, almost suffocating forests, Coldbrook was a town seemingly frozen in time. The streets were lined with aging buildings, their exteriors worn down by the passage of decades, and the air always had a faint, musty scent to it, a mix of pine, damp earth, and something I couldn't quite place. The first few weeks were uneventful. The townspeople were kind, though a bit distant, and my job at the local radio station was straightforward. WCOL 89.1 FM was a small, independent station that mostly played oldies and catered to the dwindling population of Coldbrook. It was run by a skeleton crew, just me, an old sound engineer named Frank, and an eccentric DJ who went by the name of Jake the Snake Thompson. Jake was in his late 40s, with a weathered face and a voice that seemed tailor-made for radio. He was the kind of guy who had seen it all and carried an air of mystery around him. He would often come into the station late at night, well after my shift had ended, to host a show called The Witching Hour. It was a bizarre, freeform show where Jake played everything from obscure records to unsettling soundscapes, punctuated by eerie stories and strange musings. I never listened to it, though. I valued my sleep too much. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I decided to tune in. The station's signal was weak, and the audio crackled with static. But Jake's deep, gravelly voice came through clearly. "Welcome to the witching hour," he drawled, pausing for dramatic effect. "Tonight, we're going to talk about secrets." There was something in his tone that sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't stop listening. Jake rambled on about how every town had its secrets, things that the residents preferred to keep buried, things that outsiders wouldn't understand. I was about to switch off the radio when Jake said something that made me freeze. "You ever wonder why no one ever leaves Coldbrook?" he asked, his voice laced with an unsettling curiosity. "Oh, people come here, sure, but no one ever leaves. Not really. They may try, but the town doesn't let them go." My heart skipped a beat. I'd noticed the same thing, how the town seemed to trap people. Those who were born here never left, and those who moved in, like me, seemed to lose all desire to go anywhere else. Jake continued, his voice growing more intense. "There's something here, something that feeds on us, and when it's done, it spits out what's left, but by then it's too late." I turned off the radio, feeling a deep sense of unease. I tried to brush off Jake's words as just another one of his creepy stories, but they lingered in my mind. That night, I had trouble sleeping, and when I finally did, I was plagued by nightmares. The next day, I mentioned Jake's broadcast to Frank, hoping he could shed some light on the strange things Jake had said. Frank sighed, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Jake's been here a long time. He knows things about this town, things you wouldn't believe." I pressed him for more details, but Frank just shook his head and changed the subject. That only made me more curious. As the days passed, I found myself growing more and more obsessed with Jake's late-night show. I began staying up to listen to it, and every night Jake would reveal more about the town's dark history, stories of people who had gone missing, of strange lights seen in the forest, of whispered legends that the townspeople refused to discuss. The more I listened, the more I felt like I was losing touch with reality. The once comforting routine of my life in Coldbrook started to unravel. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer and more oppressive. One night, after an especially disturbing broadcast, I decided I needed to confront Jake. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what he knew. I drove to the radio station, the narrow roads winding through the forest like a snake. The trees loomed over me, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick with fog, and the headlights barely penetrated the darkness. When I arrived at the station, it was eerily quiet. The building was dark except for the small, dim light in the broadcast booth. I could see Jake inside, hunched over the microphone, speaking in his usual hushed tones. I entered the building and made my way to the booth, but as I approached, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, and when I pushed it open, the room was filled with a low, vibrating hum. Jake looked up at me, his eyes wide and wild. He didn't seem surprised to see me, almost as if he had been expecting me. "Ah, you finally came," he said, his voice distorted by the hum. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry and my voice caught in my throat. Jake gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit, there's something you need to hear." Reluctantly, I sat down. Jake leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "The town. It's alive. It's been feeding on us for generations. Every thought, every fear, every nightmare, it consumes them. And the more we believe in it, the stronger it gets." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "What are you talking about?" Jake's eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I noticed how hollow they looked. "You've been listening to the show, haven't you? You've felt it, haven't you? The town knows when you're listening. It knows when you're scared. It's been watching you." I wanted to leave, to get as far away from the station as possible, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Jake leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "There's only one way out," he said softly, "but you have to be strong enough to let go." Before I could ask what he meant, the hum grew louder and the room seemed to close in around me. The walls pulsed with a dark energy, and I felt a pressure building in my head, as if something was trying to force its way in. Jake's voice cut through the noise. "You need to stop listening, you need to stop believing." I stood up, my legs unsteady, and stumbled out of the booth. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long and dark. I could feel the town watching me, waiting for me to falter. But I didn't. I kept moving, forcing myself to ignore the whispers in the back of my mind, the dark thoughts that clawed at my sanity. When I finally burst out of the station and into the night air, I felt like I could breathe again. I jumped into my car and drove, not caring where I ended up as long as it was away from Coldbrook. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town over. I checked into a motel and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and shaken. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't even turn on the TV. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to forget everything I had heard. The next morning, I called my boss and quit my job. I packed up my things and left Coldbrook for good. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, and I didn't look back. Years have passed since that night, but I still think about Coldbrook sometimes. I wonder if the town is still there, still feeding on the fears and doubts of those who remain. I wonder if Jake is still hosting his show, still trying to warn people about the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface. I don't listen to the radio anymore. I can't. Because sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I can still hear that low, vibrating hum. And I know that if I let it, it will consume me, just like it did to all the others who came before me. So I keep moving, never staying in one place too long, never letting my guard down, because I know that the town is still out there, waiting for me to slip, waiting for me to listen. And when I do, it will finally have me. The old man in the mirror. When Jessica moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street, she was thrilled. It was her first place on her own, a charming, if slightly worn home that seemed to have a personality all its own. The floors creaked in the right way, the walls had a history, and the intricate woodwork was a marvel from a bygone era. There was just one quirk she hadn't noticed during her initial visits, the large ornate mirror in the upstairs hallway. The mirror was old, framed in dark, heavy wood, with carvings of twisted vines and grotesque faces etched into the corners. It hung at the end of the hallway, directly opposite her bedroom door. There was something off about the mirror, something that made her uncomfortable every time she passed by. It was almost as if the mirror was watching her. At first, Jessica tried to ignore it. The mirror was probably worth something, and besides, it was too heavy to move on her own. But as the days went by, the sense of unease grew. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision or the feeling of being watched when she was alone. But then, one night, everything changed. Jessica was brushing her teeth in the bathroom when she thought she heard something behind her, a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps on the old wooden floor. She glanced up at the bathroom mirror but saw nothing unusual. Shaking off the feeling, she turned off the light and stepped into the hallway. As she walked toward her bedroom, she passed the mirror and froze. For a split second she saw him, a gaunt elderly man with hollow eyes and skin stretched tight over his bones. He stood in the reflection, not in the hallway behind her, but within the mirror itself, staring directly at her. Jessica whipped around, expecting to see someone standing in the hallway, but there was no one there. Heart pounding, she turned back to the mirror, but the man was gone. She laughed nervously, convincing herself that it had been a trick of the light, her imagination playing tricks on her. But the image of the old man haunted her dreams that night, his hollow eyes burning into her mind. The next day, she tried to put the incident out of her head, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that mirror. When she passed by it during the day, she felt the same prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as if she were being watched, but she refused to look into it, afraid of what she might see. That night, Jessica lay in bed, unable to sleep. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wood. She tried to close her eyes, but every time she did, she saw the old man's face, his eyes hollow and unblinking. Suddenly she heard it again, the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. Jessica's heart raced as she strained to listen, the sound unmistakable in the quiet of the night. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, growing closer to her bedroom. She sat up in bed, her eyes fixed on the crack of light beneath her door. The footsteps stopped just outside her door, and she held her breath, waiting, terrified of what might come next. For what felt like hours, there was nothing, just silence. But then from the hallway she heard a faint, raspy whisper, like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Look at me." Jessica's blood ran cold. The voice was coming from the mirror. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but the whisper came again, louder this time, insistent. "Look at me." The voice sent a shiver down her spine, freezing her in place. She knew she should get up, open the door and confront whatever was out there, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear. The whisper came again, almost a growl now, dripping with malice. "Look at me." Unable to resist, Jessica slowly got out of bed and walked to her bedroom door. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She opened the door a crack and peered out into the hallway. It was empty. But the mirror at the end of the hallway was different. The old man was there again, standing in the reflection, his bony hand pressed against the glass. His eyes locked onto hers, and his lips moved as he whispered one final time. "Look at me." Jessica couldn't look away. She stepped out into the hallway, her feet moving as if they were not her own, drawn toward the mirror by some unseen force. The closer she got, the more clearly she could see him, his hollow eyes, his sunken cheeks, his skeletal hand reaching out to her. She stopped inches from the mirror, her breath fogging up the glass. The old man's mouth twisted into a smile, revealing yellowed teeth sharp and pointed. His eyes burned with a sickly light, full of hunger, full of malice. And then, before she could react, his hand shot out of the mirror, cold and clammy, gripping her wrist with a strength that belied his frail appearance. Jessica screamed, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron tight. She watched in horror as the man began to pull her toward the mirror. The surface of the glass rippled like water, and she felt herself being drawn in, her reflection distorting as the mirror swallowed her whole. She struggled, digging her heels into the floor, but it was no use. The old man's grin widened as he pulled her closer, his laughter a harsh, grating sound that filled her ears. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was his face, inches from hers, his eyes glowing with a malevolent glee. The next morning, when the landlord came by to check on the house, he found the hallway empty. The mirror was there, as it always had been, its surface smooth and undisturbed. But Jessica was gone, vanished without a trace. The landlord frowned, puzzled but not overly concerned. The old Victorian had a way of losing tenants, people who came and went, leaving without notice, their belongings left behind, as if they had simply disappeared. He didn't question it anymore. He glanced at the mirror, noticing something strange. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure in the reflection, a young woman with wide, terrified eyes, her hands pressed against the glass, as if she were trapped inside. But when he looked again, there was nothing there. The landlord shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination, and walked away. As he closed the door behind him, the mirror in the hallway stood silent and still, its surface dark and empty. But if you looked closely, deep within the glass, you might just see the faint outline of a figure, watching, waiting. And every so often, when the house was quiet, you could hear a whisper, soft and distant, like the rustling of old leaves. "Look at me." The silent self. I used to work late nights at a call center, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights flickered just a bit too often. One night I was alone in the break room, sipping stale coffee and scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something odd. A message popped up on my screen from an unknown number. "Look up." I chuckled, thinking it was one of my co-workers playing a prank. But when I looked up, the room was empty, just me and the humming vending machine. The message was unsettling, but I brushed it off. As the night dragged on, more messages came. "Don't turn around. Do you see it too?" Each message sent a shiver down my spine, but I convinced myself it was just a sick joke. That was until I got the next one. "I'm in the reflection." My blood ran cold. I was sitting in front of a blank computer screen, the kind that acts like a mirror in the dim light. Slowly, I forced myself to look at the screen, heart pounding. At first it was just me, then behind me a shadow began to form. It was a dark, shapeless figure with glowing eyes. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it raise a hand, mirroring mine. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to scream. Then it waved. The final message came through. "Switch places?" And before I could react, the power went out. The room was plunged into total darkness. When the lights flickered back on, I was staring at the screen again. My reflection was normal, but something was different. I wasn't in the break room anymore. I was in a place that looked just like it, but wrong. The colors were muted, the sounds distorted. My phone buzzed again. "Thank you." Now I'm stuck here, watching that thing live my life on the other side. It smiles at me sometimes from the reflection, a twisted version of my own face. I don't know how long I can stay sane in this place, but I do know one thing. It's waiting for someone else to take my spot. So, if you ever get a strange message late at night, don't look up, or you might just end up here too.